My name is Thomas. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worn the kind of success that doesn't shout. I live in a world of contracts, board meetings, and quiet numbers that move quietly but shape everything. Property, equity, trusts. The kinds of assets that people assume come with a certain personality. The truth is, I've never fit the stereotype. People tend to read me wrong. They see a calm man with measured words and think it means I'm passive. They hear me pause before answering and assume I'm unsure. They watch me avoid public arguments and decide I must be easy to steer. I've spent years letting that misunderstanding exist because most days it keeps life simple. It also keeps people honest, or at least reveals who they become when they think no one is paying attention. This story isn't a revenge tale. It's not a dramatic courtroom performance. It's a record of what happened to me and what I learned about love, power, and the kind of betrayal that doesn't arrive with a raised voice. Just a steady hand and a convincing smile. It begins with something small. A routine. A marriage that looked stable from the outside, and a wife who seemed attentive in the way people admire. It turns into something else slowly, almost invisibly, until the day everything snapped into focus. The moment I discovered my wife was secretly overdosing me with sleeping pills to legitimately inherit my vast fortune. Not in the sensational way those words sound, but in the quiet, clinical way reality often reveals itself, through patterns, paperwork, and the dull certainty of evidence. I'll tell you what I noticed first. Fatigue, fog, gaps in memory I tried to explain away. I'll tell you what I ignored, because it was easier to trust the person beside me than to question my own mind. And I'll tell you how I finally understood the truth. What I thought were harmless doses turned out to be a calculated attempt to secure my wealth. There's pain in this story, yes, but there's also restraint. There's the discipline of not reacting emotionally when you realize your life may have been treated like a transaction. There's the strange clarity of choosing to protect yourself without becoming cruel. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Have you ever looked back at a relationship and realized the warning signs were always there, just wearing a softer face?
If you wife described me as
If you asked her friends, they would have said I was lucky to have her. Said it with a laugh that sounded harmless but carried something sharp underneath. If you asked my colleagues, they would have described me as cautious, conservative, safe. None of them was entirely wrong. I've never been the loudest man in a room. I don't dominate conversations. I don't announce my accomplishments. When you manage wealth for a living, you learn that noise attracts risk. Silence builds leverage. But at home, that silence began to mean something else. To her, I think it meant predictability. Stability. A man who would sign whatever needed signing, attend whatever dinner needed attending, and smile politely when she corrected small details about me in front of others. She hates taking pills, she once told her friends, laughing lightly. If I didn't organize his vitamins and sleep supplements, he'd forget everything. I remember that night clearly. We were at our dining table. 6 people. Wine glasses, candlelight. She said it casually, like a caring spouse joking about her forgetful husband. Everyone laughed. I smiled too, because it was easier. The truth was, I had always managed my own routines meticulously. My health, my schedule, my investments, every variable was tracked. But in social settings, I let her speak. I let her narrate. It wasn't weakness, it was a choice. But over time, a narrative repeated often enough becomes identity in other people's minds. Thomas is quiet. Thomas is a little absent-minded. Thomas needs looking after. She would hand me my evening tea with a gentle reminder. Don't forget your sleep support. She would leave the pills in a neat ceramic dish on the kitchen counter. She would kiss my temple and say, "You work too hard. You need this." It looked like love, and I never publicly questioned it. In truth, I had been feeling tired for months. A heavy, dragging fatigue that didn't match my lifestyle. I exercise regularly. I eat carefully. I rarely drink beyond a single glass of wine. Yet I began waking up groggy, my thoughts moving more slowly than usual. I attributed it to stress. Private equity is not gentle work. You're constantly evaluating risk, calculating future outcomes, and preparing for worst-case scenarios. I told myself the exhaustion was earned, and when she'd look at me with concern, "You're pushing yourself too hard again," I believed that too. What people often misunderstand about men like me is this: we don't assume betrayal quickly. We assume responsibility first. If something feels off, we look inward before we look outward. So when I started misplacing small things, documents I never misplace, calendar alerts I didn't remember setting, I blame myself. She didn't. She stepped in more. I'll handle the insurance paperwork. I'll talk to your estate planner. I'll make sure everything's updated. It sounded supportive, organized, responsible, and to everyone watching from the outside, I was fortunate. Fortunate to have a wife so attentive. Fortunate to have someone who took care of the details. Fortunate that I didn't need to worry about the domestic side of life. I let them believe that, because I've always known something simple. The more invisible you appear, the more clearly you can observe. And at that stage, I was still observing, not accusing, not suspecting, just quietly taking note. The small jokes, the subtle reframing of who I was. She gently positions herself as the more capable one in personal matters. It didn't hurt, not then, but it planted something. A question without shape yet. And questions, if you let them breathe long enough, eventually become clarity. Looking back, the first real cut wasn't physical. It was administrative. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind that dissolves into spreadsheets and conference calls. I had just wrapped a call with our London office when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from my bank, one I rarely saw during business hours because most large movements required my direct authorization. Beneficiary update confirmed. I frowned. I hadn't updated any beneficiaries. At first, I assumed it was routine, perhaps something my estate attorney had processed. My financial life is layered across trusts, holding companies, and staggered insurance policies. Updates happen, but not without my signature. I opened the banking app. There it was. My primary life insurance policy, 8 figures, had been amended. The secondary contingent beneficiaries had been removed. The sole primary beneficiary was now my wife. That alone wasn't unusual. She had always been a primary beneficiary. But the structure had changed. Previously, a percentage had been allocated to a charitable trust I'd set up in my father's name. Quiet philanthropy, no press, just something that mattered to me. Now it was gone, replaced, fully consolidated. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. It wasn't anger I felt. It was something colder. Confusion. I called my estate attorney's private line. Not his office. Him. Did we finalize changes to my life insurance this week? I asked casually. There was a pause. Paper shuffling. Keyboard clicking. No, he said slowly. We haven't touched that policy in over a year. Silence settled in my office like dust. I thanked him and hung up. Then I did something I've trained myself to do in every negotiation. I slowed down. Instead of calling my wife immediately, instead of reacting from ego, I checked the digital authorization trail. The change had been processed through my online credentials. My credentials. 2-factor authentication has been confirmed, which meant someone had access to my phone at the time of verification. I leaned back in my chair and tried to reconstruct that day. It had been a Sunday evening. I remembered being unusually tired. We'd had dinner at home. She had made herbal tea afterward, something she'd started doing regularly to help me unwind. I remembered sitting on the couch. I remembered feeling heavy. After that, the memory blurred. Not blattled.
Black.
Just softened at the edges, like a photograph out of focus. When I got home that night, she was in the kitchen, humming softly while chopping vegetables. Hey, she smiled. Long day. Productive, I replied, placing my briefcase down. I studied her face for something. Guilt, anxiety, defensiveness. There was none. She moved around the kitchen easily. Comfortable, unrushed. I got an alert about the life insurance update, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Did you happen to schedule something with the attorney? She didn't freeze. She didn't stumble. Oh, she said lightly, as if remembering something small. Yes, we talked about simplifying everything. You were half asleep, but you agreed. You said it made sense to consolidate. I searched my memory again. Half asleep. You remember? She asked, tilting her head slightly. I didn't. But here's the thing about subtle disrespect. It doesn't arrive as an accusation. It arrives as an implication. You were tired. You forgot. I handled it. And if you question it, you're questioning your own reliability. That's fine, I said calmly. I just wanted to confirm. She smiled, relieved, though only faintly. You've been so exhausted lately, Thomas. I worry about you. There it was again. Exhausted, fragile, needing oversight. That night, she placed the small ceramic dish beside my glass of water. 2 pale tablets. Doctor recommended adjusting the dose slightly, she said. Just temporarily. I picked one up between my fingers. When did I speak to the doctor? I asked. She laughed softly. You didn't. I did. You said I could. Again, permission granted in moments I couldn't fully recall. It was small, almost invisible. But something inside me shifted. Not suspicion yet, just awareness. In finance, there's a term, material deviation. It refers to a small change that signals deeper instability beneath the surface. This felt like that. I swallowed the pills that night. Not because I trusted her completely, but I needed more data. And from that point on, I stopped assuming fatigue was random. I started observing patterns, quietly, without confrontation, because the first small cut doesn't bleed loudly. It teaches you where to look. The most dangerous shifts in a relationship don't feel dangerous at first. They feel practical, efficient, helpful. After the insurance change, nothing exploded. There was no dramatic argument, no visible crack in our routine. If anything, she became softer, more attentive. She would ask about my meetings, sit beside me while I answered emails, and brush her hand lightly across my shoulder as if grounding me. And I told myself what any reasonable husband would tell himself: you're overthinking this. The fatigue continued, but now I measured it. I began logging my sleep patterns, my alertness levels, and the exact time I took what she handed me. I didn't tell her. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I simply started documenting. Still, I swallowed the pills, and every morning the fog was thicker. Small mistakes began creeping into my days. Nothing catastrophic, just slightly off. I'd reread emails twice to ensure they made sense. I'd feel a strange lag between thought and speech in meetings. No one else seemed to notice, but she did. You seem slower lately, she said one evening, not unkindly. Maybe you should consider stepping back from some responsibilities. It was framed as concern, but it landed differently. Slower, that word lingered. At dinner with friends, she started finishing my sentences. Thomas means... What he's trying to say is, he's been under a lot of pressure, so sometimes he forgets details. Each time she smiled warmly. Each time, because challenging it would make me appear defensive, insecure, and I don't perform insecurity in public. That's how normalization works. It isn't about a single insult. It's about repetition so subtle that even you begin adjusting to it. One afternoon, I received a call from our firm's compliance officer. Routine annual review. He mentioned casually that my wife had reached out to request clarification about power of attorney provisions in case of cognitive decline. I sat very still. She said it was precautionary, he added quickly. Given how busy you've been. Cognitive decline. The phrase didn't match my reality. I run multi-million-dollar acquisitions. I negotiate across continents. My memory for numbers is precise to the decimal. Yet inside my home, a parallel narrative was forming. Thomas is tired. Thomas is overwhelmed. Thomas may not be fully capable right now. And the more I heard it, the more I understood something chilling. If enough people believe a story, it becomes easier to formalize it, to justify decisions, to consolidate control. That realization didn't ignite anger in me. It triggered discipline. I stopped taking the pills every night. Instead, I would discreetly pocket them, replace them later, keep them sealed in a small envelope inside my office drawer. The nights I didn't take them, something remarkable happened. I woke clear, sharp, rested. The contrast was undeniable. And yet, when I mentioned feeling better, she frowned. That's strange, she said. You looked exhausted last night. I watched her closely then, not for villainy, not for dramatic tells, just for alignment between her words and my lived experience. There was none. Her concern felt rehearsed. And still, I didn't confront her, because here's the quiet truth about men like me. We don't move when emotions spike. We move when patterns solidify. The disrespect wasn't loud. It was structural. She was positioning herself as the stable one, the responsible one, the rational caretaker of a husband who might be slipping. And if I had reacted prematurely, I would have played directly into that narrative. So I did what I've always done when the numbers don't add up. I stayed calm. I gathered more evidence. I let her believe I hadn't noticed. Because silence, when chosen deliberately, is not submission. It's calibration. And by then, I knew something wasn't right. I just didn't know how far it went. There's a moment in every slow betrayal when you realize you've been cast in a part you never auditioned for. For me, that moment didn't come with raised voices or a dramatic revelation. It came during a brunch at her sister's house. Sunlight through wide windows. Ceramic plates. Casual laughter. I remember reaching for my coffee when her sister said lightly, "How are you feeling lately, Thomas? We've been worried." Worried. The word didn't belong there. "I'm fine," I replied evenly. My wife placed her hand gently over mine. "He's just been so fatigued. It's been hard watching him push himself." There it was again. The narrative expands outward. I looked around the table. No one challenged it. No one looked surprised. The story had already been told in rooms I wasn't in. He's tired. He's forgetting things. He's not quite himself. And I understood something with uncomfortable clarity. I wasn't just being described as exhausted. I was being repositioned. After brunch, as we drove home, I kept my voice neutral. You've mentioned my fatigue to a few people, I said. She exhaled softly. Because I love you. Because I'm concerned. You don't see what I see. And what do you see? I asked. A man who needs support. It sounded kind, but hidden inside was an assumption that I couldn't accurately assess my own condition. That she could. That others should trust her perspective over mine. That was the role. Reliable but fragile. Successful but declining. Brilliant in business, but not fully capable in personal matters. It was strategic in its subtlety. No one questions a caring spouse. No one suspects someone who frames everything as protection. Over the next few weeks, I noticed administrative details shifting. Mail redirected to a shared email. She managed to reduce my stress. Calls from my financial institutions were answered by her when I was resting. A draft document left open on our home printer referencing updated durable power of attorney provisions. She wasn't seizing control. She was easing into it. And to anyone observing from the outside, it would look responsible, even admirable. If something were to happen to me, a health complication, cognitive impairment, she would already be positioned as decision-maker, legally, financially, publicly. The most unsettling part wasn't the paperwork. It was how calmly she discussed it. One evening, as she handed me the familiar ceramic dish, she said casually, "We should simplify more of your structures. It would make everything smoother if, something happened." Something? I repeated. You've been so run down, Thomas. It's just smart planning. Smart planning. That phrase lingered long after she went to bed. I stayed in the kitchen alone that night, the house quiet around me, the two pale tablets resting in my palm, and I finally allowed myself to ask the question I'd been avoiding. If I truly were declining, who would benefit most from formalizing that belief? The answer wasn't emotional. It was mathematical. My estate, consolidated and unchallenged, would transfer to her entirely under the revised structure. The charitable trust was removed. Secondary contingencies gone. The layers simplified. Clean. Efficient. Legitimate. I looked at my reflection in the dark kitchen window. I wasn't angry. I was alert, because I now understood the role she had assigned me. The quietly fading husband. The one whose health justified protective oversight. The one whose wealth required a steady hand to manage when he no longer could. And I realized something even more important. She believed I had accepted that role. She believed I hadn't noticed. She believed I was too tired to see the architecture forming around me. That belief was her first real miscalculation, because invisibility can be a weapon. And I had just stopped being passive inside my own story. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen when I found a document or uncovered a message. It happened on an ordinary Wednesday morning. I woke before sunrise, naturally. No alarm, no fog, no heaviness pressing behind my eyes, because the night before, I hadn't taken the pills. I had pretended to swallow them. Water, slight tilt of the head, casual movement. Then I had slipped them into my pocket and flushed them later. It was the third night in a row I'd done that, and the difference was undeniable. My thoughts felt like clean glass instead of smudged mirrors. I moved through my morning routine with a precision I hadn't felt in months. Numbers aligned effortlessly in my mind. Conversations from the previous day replayed with perfect clarity. There was nothing wrong with me. Nothing. I stood in the kitchen, watching the sky lighten over Boston, and felt something unfamiliar. Not fear, not anger. Certainty. When she came downstairs, she studied me almost immediately. "You're up early," she said. "I slept well," I replied. She poured coffee slowly, eyes lingering on me. "That's good. You've looked so drained lately." There it was again, the reinforcement. I smiled gently. Maybe I just needed better rest. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. It was subtle, but I caught it. Later that afternoon, I made an appointment, not with our family doctor, but with a private toxicologist a colleague once recommended during a corporate poisoning case years ago. Not dramatic, just discreet. I brought the pills. He examined them without commentary, ran tests while I waited. When he returned, his tone was professional, neutral. "These are prescription-grade sedative hypnotics," he said. "Stronger than standard over-the-counter sleep aids." My jaw didn't tighten, my hands didn't shake. I simply asked, "In what dosage?" He showed me the report. The recommended dose for someone of my weight was significantly lower than what had been compounded into the tablets I brought. "Long-term use at this level," he added carefully, "could impair cognition, memory, reaction time." Could, not might, could. I thanked him, paid in cash, and walked back to my car with the kind of composure that only comes when the final variable locks into place. The fatigue wasn't stress. The fog wasn't burned out. It was chemical, measured, sustained, and I finally allowed myself to think the full sentence. What I thought were harmless doses turned out to be a calculated attempt to secure my wealth. But here's what matters. I didn't rage. I didn't confront her that night. I didn't even change my behavior outwardly. Instead, something inside me went completely still. Not frozen, aligned. Because once you know the truth, panic is wasted energy. Action requires clarity. That evening, she handed me the ceramic dish again. 2 tablets. The doctor suggested we continue a bit longer, she said. I took them, met her eyes, and smiled faintly. Of course, she kissed my cheek, and for the first time, I wasn't trying to interpret her expression. I wasn't searching for guilt or malice. I was simply observing a person who believed her plan was working. That belief would become her greatest vulnerability. That night, I didn't swallow the pills. I placed them beside the others I had collected, and I began mapping, not emotionally, but structurally, what needed to happen next. The shift wasn't explosive. It was internal. I stopped being confused. I stopped rationalizing. I stopped hoping for a misunderstanding. And I stepped fully into awareness. From that moment forward, my silence was no longer uncertain. It was a strategy. There's a difference between not knowing what to say and choosing not to say it. Before that Wednesday, my silence had been exploratory. I was gathering impressions, testing inconsistencies, observing the slow construction of a narrative around me. After the toxicology report, silence became intentional. I stopped taking the pills entirely. Every night, I performed the same small ritual: water, swallow gesture, soft nod. Every morning, I woke clear. Within a week, my performance at work sharpened noticeably. I closed a stalled acquisition. I identified a mispriced asset our competitors had overlooked. My partners commented on my renewed focus. At home, however, I allowed a different story to continue. One evening, she sat across from me at dinner, watching carefully. "You seem different," she said. "Different how?" "More alert." I held her gaze calmly. "Is that a problem?" She smiled quickly. Of course not. I just want you healthy." Healthy. The word felt almost ironic. I realized then that my recovery disrupted her timeline. If I remained foggy, fatigued, and gradually diminished, the progression toward expanded control would appear logical, protective, necessary. But clarity complicates narratives, so I adjusted my strategy. I didn't return to full visible sharpness at home. I modulated it. Occasionally, I'd pause longer before answering a question. I'd rub my temples once in a while. I'd let her believe improvement was uneven. Because strategy isn't about dramatic exposure. It's about controlling pace. Meanwhile, I began securing my perimeter. I met privately with my estate attorney, off the books, no shared calendar entries. I updated passwords, restructured digital authentication methods, and initiated a quiet forensic review of my account access logs. The data was precise. Every beneficiary change, every login from our home IP address occurs during late evening hours. Every 2-factor confirmation triggered within minutes of my reported deep sleep. The pattern was undeniable. But still I waited, because evidence alone isn't leverage until positioned correctly. At social gatherings, she continued the narrative gently. "He's been so exhausted. I'm trying to lighten his load. We're updating documents just to be safe." Each time I nodded mildly. I noticed something interesting. The more I appeared compliant, the more relaxed she became. Her vigilance softened. Her confidence grew. She began discussing long-term plans more openly. Renovations to the house in case we stayed long-term. Travel ideas she'd postponed until things stabilized. Stabilized, as if my supposed decline were temporary turbulence before a controlled landing. What she didn't realize was that silence had stopped being defensive. It was now diagnostic. I was studying her patience, her expectations, her assumptions about my awareness. And I was learning something crucial. She believed I feared conflict more than anything. She believed my calm nature meant I would avoid confrontation at all costs. That belief made her bold. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone in the study. "I just need him to sign a few more things," she said softly. "He trusts me." There was no malice in her tone, just a calculation. I stepped away quietly before she could notice, not because I was afraid, but because premature confrontation would collapse the entire architecture before I understood its full extent. Silence, when misunderstood, is often seen as weakness. But in negotiation and in survival, it is often the most powerful position. You allow the other party to believe they are ahead. You allow them to commit further, and you wait until their own momentum makes retreat impossible. By then, my fear had dissolved. In its place was something steadier. Control, not over her actions, but over my response. And that distinction would matter more than anything. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. It looks like routine. After I confirmed what the pills were and what they were doing, I stopped thinking like a husband and started thinking like a strategist protecting an asset. Not the money, my autonomy. The first thing I did was expand the documentation. Every pill she handed me went into a labeled evidence bag, dated and time-stamped. I purchased a small safe and installed it inside a locked drawer in my private office downtown, an office she never visited because she preferred the optics of our home workspace. I scheduled blood work under the pretense of an executive wellness panel. The results were clear. Residual levels of sedative compounds consistent with repeated ingestion. Nothing catastrophic, but measurable. That mattered, because intent is difficult to prove. Patterns are not. Next, I met with a litigation attorney who specialized in fiduciary abuse and coercive control. I did not accuse my wife of anything outright. I presented hypotheticals. If someone were altering medication without disclosure, I asked evenly, and restructuring estate instruments during periods of impairment, what would that constitute? He didn't look shocked. He looked clinical. Premeditated exploitation, he said. Possibly attempted financial abuse. Depending on dosage and risk, more. I nodded once. What if the person doesn't yet know they've been discovered? He studied me carefully. Then you don't confront them until every safeguard is in place. That aligned with my instincts, so I moved quietly. I reversed the beneficiary changes, not publicly, not abruptly. I shifted assets into a newly established irrevocable trust managed by a third-party fiduciary firm. Layers of legal insulation that required multiple independent authorizations. I updated my medical directives. I inserted clauses requiring independent neurological evaluations before any cognitive incapacity claim could trigger power of attorney activation. No more unilateral assumptions. No more simplified transfers. Everything now required verification, and I did it all without alerting her. At home, nothing changed on the surface. She still prepared tea, still placed the ceramic dish beside my glass, still touched my shoulder gently when we hosted dinners, but I noticed something subtle over time. Her dosage adjustments increased. 3 tablets one night instead of 2, a slightly different color, as if impatience was growing, as if the timeline needed acceleration. That detail told me everything. This wasn't careless. It was adaptive. One evening, while she showered, I checked the cabinet where she kept household medications. Behind a row of vitamin bottles was a pharmacy bag with her name on it, not mine. Inside were refill slips for the sedative prescription, prescribed to her, not to me, which meant she had obtained it under her own care and repurposed it, legally indefensible. That discovery didn't make me shake. It made me precise. I photographed everything, documented serial numbers, left it exactly where I found it. Because here's what most people misunderstand about quiet people. We don't escalate emotionally. We escalate structurally. I began recording certain conversations, not for drama, not for exposure, but for clarity. Mentions of my decline, her references to simplify and control, her casual remarks about how overwhelmed I seemed. Every word built context, and context builds cases. Meanwhile, I adjusted my own behavior carefully. I increased visible competence at work, public wins, board recognition, PRs, press mentions. I ensured that any external narrative about my cognitive health contradicted the private one she was building. 2 realities cannot coexist forever. Eventually, one collapses. The key is deciding which one will survive. Through all of this, I never raised my voice, never accused, never flinched, because the most powerful leverage isn't anger. It's timing. She believed I was deteriorating. She believed the architecture was almost complete. What she never noticed was that every structure she built had already been reinforced against her. Almost ready. The moment of full clarity didn't happen in my house. It happened in a quiet conference room overlooking the harbour. 3 people sat across from me, my estate attorney, the litigation specialist, and a senior partner from the fiduciary firm now managing my restructured trust. On the table between us was a single, organised file. Inside it, toxicology reports, blood work results, pharmacy documentation, login records, audio transcripts, updated estate instruments, no raised voices, no dramatic declarations, just evidence. My litigation attorney spoke first. Based on what you've presented, there's clear documentation of unauthorized medication administration and financial positioning during periods of chemical impairment. He didn't say poisoning, he didn't say attempted murder, because this wasn't a crime drama. It was calculated financial coercion wrapped in domestic familiarity. My estate attorney added calmly, "Your assets are now fully insulated. Even if an incapacity claim were attempted, it would trigger independent medical evaluations and a third-party review. She cannot assume control unilaterally anymore." That sentence landed heavier than I expected. She cannot assume control. The power dynamic had shifted completely. not emotionally, legally, structurally. I asked one question. If I choose not to pursue criminal action immediately, what are my options? The room remained steady. You can initiate divorce proceedings citing financial exploitation and coercive control, the litigator replied. You can present evidence privately in settlement negotiations, or you can wait longer and document further. Options, multiple paths, all of them are irreversible. And in that moment, I understood something important about myself. I didn't want spectacles. I didn't want her publicly destroyed. I wanted separation, clean, undeniable, final. After the meeting, I walked along the harbour alone. The air was sharp. The water is still. I replayed the past year in my mind. Not the financial maneuvers, not the documents, but the quieter memories. Her hand on my shoulder. Her voice told others I was exhausted. Her careful positioning of concern as control. I asked myself a question that mattered more than any legal strategy. Did I ever truly know her? Or did I only know the version that benefited from my trust? There was grief in that thought. Not for the money, not for the betrayal itself, but for the realization that intimacy had been leveraged, that my calm nature, my unwillingness to assume malice, had been interpreted as vulnerability. And still I felt no hatred, only clarity, because once the truth is undeniable, emotion becomes secondary. That evening at home, she was reviewing something on her laptop when I walked in. "You look thoughtful," she said lightly. "Just work," I replied. She nodded, satisfied. She believed she was ahead. She believed I was still navigating fog. What she didn't know was that every safeguard was now in place, every asset secured, every legal mechanism is reinforced. If she accelerated her plan, it would fail. If she attempted incapacity claims, they would collapse. If she sought to consolidate wealth through my deterioration, the structure would resist. The leverage had flipped quietly, and only I knew. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph, just a calm internal acknowledgement. The architecture of control she built no longer leads where she thinks it does. That was the private reveal, not to her, to myself. I was no longer reacting. I was choosing. Once you understand the full shape of a betrayal, the question isn't what happened. The question is what kind of man you're going to be about it. I sat alone in my office late one evening, the city lights reflecting against the glass, and laid out my options with the same discipline I use in business acquisitions. Option 1. Confront her immediately, present the evidence, demand explanation, watch her reaction. Tempting, but emotionally driven. And emotionally driven actions are unpredictable. Option 2. File criminal charges. The documentation was strong enough to open an investigation. Unauthorized administration of prescription sedatives. Financial restructuring during impairment. It could escalate quickly. But that path would become public, loud, messy. Her name would be dragged through headlines. Mine would follow. My firm would absorb the shockwave. My family, extended relatives, aging mother, would be pulled into a narrative they never asked for. Option 3. Strategic exit. Secure assets. Preserve reputation. Initiate divorce proceedings citing irreconcilable differences while privately presenting evidence during settlement. Maintain control of the timeline. Allow consequences to unfold quietly but decisively. No spectacle, no shouting, just irreversible separation. I examined my reflection faintly mirrored in the window. There was a time in my 20s when betrayal would have triggered ego, a need to prove dominance, to retaliate visibly. But I'm not that man anymore. My father once told me something when I inherited my first major asset portfolio. Real power, he said, is the ability to leave without explaining yourself. That sentence returned to me now with precision. If I confronted her emotionally, she would deny, rationalize, perhaps even attempt to accelerate whatever plan remained unfinished. If I filed charges immediately, I would win legally, but lose peace. But if I removed myself structurally first, if I dismantled the incentive quietly, then the architecture she built would collapse under its own weight. I didn't need revenge. I needed distance. That night, she placed the ceramic dish beside my water again. 3 tablets now, a subtle escalation. I picked one up, turned it between my fingers thoughtfully. "Do you ever worry," I asked calmly, "about what would happen if I weren't here?" She froze, just slightly. "What do you mean?" "Hypothetically," I said. "If something happened to me." Her expression softened into concern almost instantly. "Thomas, don't talk like that." But I saw it. Behind the concern, a flicker of calculation. Not grief, not fear. Assessment. That was the final confirmation I needed. The decision crystallized quietly inside me. I would not confront. I would not accuse. I would not warn. I would remove myself completely and allow the evidence to speak when necessary. The next morning, I instructed my attorney to draft divorce papers. Grounds: financial exploitation and coercive conduct, filed discreetly. Service scheduled strategically, after all asset protections had been fully executed and verified. Irreversible. There is a specific calm that comes with making a final decision. It's not relief. It's alignment. When I walked through the house that evening, nothing looked different. Same furniture, same artwork. The same scent of her perfume lingered faintly in the hallway. But internally, something had ended. Not the marriage legally, not yet. But the illusion. I no longer saw her as my partner. I saw her as someone who made a calculated choice. And I responded with one of my own. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. No emotion, no improvisation, just sequence. The divorce filing was submitted on a Thursday morning under seal. My attorney ensured service would occur privately at our home, not at her workplace. Not in public. Dignity matters, even when betrayal doesn't offer it. At the same time, the fiduciary firm finalized the transfer of my most significant holdings into the irrevocable trust. Multi-signature authorization protocols were activated. Medical contingency clauses were locked in. If she attempted to trigger incapacity, she would now face independent neurological panels. External oversight. Documentation review. No shortcuts. I also made one quiet but critical move. I amended my will entirely, not out of spite, out of correction. A portion returned to my father's charitable trust. Another segment redirected to long-term philanthropic commitments I had once postponed. The rest remained structured under professional management. Her access, in the event of my death, was now limited to a reasonable but non-controlling allocation. Enough to live comfortably, not enough to control legacy. She didn't notice any of it. At home, the rhythm continued. Tea in the evening, pills on the counter. She began watching me more closely, not with affection, with evaluation. One night she asked casually, "Did you review the long-term care forms I left in your study?" "I haven't had time," I replied evenly. She leaned back slightly. "It's important we finalize them soon." Important. There was urgency beneath the word. I nodded mildly. "We'll review everything soon."
And you're sure was the
We would, just not in the way she expected. Meanwhile, I requested a formal wellness evaluation through a top-tier medical center. Not because I needed it, but because documented cognitive clarity would become relevant if narratives were contested. The neurologist's report was unambiguous. No impairment, no cognitive decline. Executive functioning is above average for my age. I placed a certified copy in my attorney's file. Preparation isn't paranoia when evidence exists. It's insurance. The final administrative step involved our shared accounts. I didn't freeze them abruptly. That would signal awareness. Instead, I segmented income streams into newly structured entities, legal, transparent, but no longer casually accessible. Liquidity narrowed, gradually. She mentioned it once over dinner. "Have you changed something with the accounts? Transfers feel slower." "Quarter-end restructuring," I replied calmly. "Risk management." She accepted it, because I had always managed risk. That was my public identity. What she didn't understand was that risk management now included her. The day service was scheduled. I left the house early for a board meeting I didn't technically need to attend. I wanted physical distance when the envelope arrived. My attorney texted me at 10:14 a.m. Served. Calm. No escalation. I stared at the message longer than expected. There was no surge of triumph, just stillness. When I returned home that evening, the atmosphere felt different, tighter. She was sitting at the dining table, the documents spread neatly in front of her. Her expression wasn't rage. It was a shock. Controlled. Measured. "You filed for divorce," she said, quietly. "Yes." She studied me carefully.
On what grounds?
"Financial exploitation," I replied evenly, "and coercive conduct." The silence that followed was dense. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She recalculated. I could see it happening in real time. But recalculation requires leverage, and she no longer had it. I placed my briefcase down gently. "We'll handle this respectfully," I added. "Through consultors, through counsel." That was all. No accusations. No dramatic unveiling of evidence. Because the power of preparation is this. You don't need to argue when the structure already speaks for you. The first consequence wasn't legal. It was psychological. The morning after she was served, the house felt unfamiliar. Not because of hostility, but because the narrative had fractured. For months, she had operated under the assumption that I was deteriorating quietly, that she was guiding, organizing, stabilizing. Now, without warning, I had initiated something precise and irreversible. She moved through the kitchen more slowly than usual. No tea prepared, no ceramic dish waiting by my glass. Instead, she watched me, not with affection, with uncertainty. "You're making a mistake," she said finally. "Possibly," I replied calmly, "but it's my mistake to make." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You think I was trying to control you?" "I think documentation will clarify everything," I said. Not accusatory, not loud, just factual. That word, documentation, shifted the energy entirely. Because people who operate through subtle positioning rely on ambiguity. Documentation removes ambiguity. By the end of the week, her attorney had contacted mine. The tone was measured but probing. They requested medical records. They requested financial explanations. They requested clarification regarding allegations. My attorney responded with selective disclosures, enough to establish seriousness, not enough to reveal full leverage. Toxicology reports were mentioned. Pharmacy documentation referenced. Login records cited. Not accusations. Facts. Her strategy shifted quickly. The narrative of my decline disappeared almost overnight. In its place came a new angle. Concern misunderstood. Medication given in good faith. Administrative changes made with consent. Consent. That word would be difficult to sustain under forensic review. Meanwhile, outside our home, people began noticing something subtle. At a firm dinner, one of my partners leaned in. "You seem sharper than ever lately," he said. "Whatever you've been doing, keep doing it." I nodded faintly. Externally, nothing had collapsed. There was no scandal, no public statement, just a quiet legal motion. At home, the atmosphere became transactional. We spoke only when necessary. She no longer mentioned my fatigue, no longer referenced exhaustion. It was as if that entire narrative had been erased from her vocabulary. That silence told me everything. If she truly believed I was declining, she would have doubled down. Instead, she retreated, because the ground beneath her assumptions was no longer stable. One evening, she approached me with a different tone. "If this is about money," she said carefully, "we can work something out privately." It wasn't an apology. It was a negotiation. "I'm not negotiating," I replied evenly. "I'm exiting." That was the first time something flashed across her face that wasn't calculation. Fear, not of losing me emotionally, of losing access. And that distinction hurt more than I expected. But consequences don't always look dramatic. Sometimes they look like shrinking options. Her attorney began pressing for settlement discussions quickly, faster than standard timelines would suggest. Why? Because prolonged litigation invites discovery, and discovery invites exposure. The very structure she had built to secure my wealth was now the structure that threatened her credibility. I didn't escalate. I didn't threaten criminal action, but the possibility existed in silence, and silence again did the work. By the second week, the ceramic dish had disappeared entirely. The pharmacy bag in the cabinet was gone. But photographs exist longer than objects, and patterns don't vanish just because containers do. The consequences had begun, not explosively, but structurally. The narrative she curated for months was dissolving quietly, and for the first time, she understood that I had never been fading. I had been watching. Regret doesn't always arrive with tears. Sometimes it arrives as urgency. By the third week of proceedings, her tone had changed completely. The confidence was gone. The careful calibration was replaced by something more fragile, controlled, but strained. She requested a private conversation one evening before our attorneys formalized the next phase. "Just 10 minutes, she said quietly. We sat across from each other at the same dining table where she once laughed with friends about managing my vitamins. The irony wasn't lost on me. "I never meant to hurt you," she began. The phrasing was precise, not, "I did this," but, "I never meant to hurt you." Intent reframed. "I was trying to protect us," she continued. "You were exhausted all the time. You weren't yourself." There it was. The original narrative resurfacing, but softer now, defensive. "I wasn't exhausted," I replied calmly. "I was sedated." She looked down at the table, silence stretched. "You agreed to take them," she said finally. "I agreed to what I believed were harmless supplements," I corrected evenly. Her hands folded tightly. "You're making this sound sinister." "I'm making it sound documented." That word again. Documentation. Evidence doesn't argue. It simply exists. She exhaled slowly. And for the first time since this began, I saw something genuine in her expression, not calculation. Realization. Because she understood something critical in that moment. This wasn't a misunderstanding I would forgive. It wasn't a conversation I would emotionally process and move past. It was a structural breach of trust. And structures, once cracked at the foundation, cannot be repaired cosmetically. "You could ruin me," she said quietly. "I don't intend to," I replied. That was true. If I had wanted destruction, I would have pursued criminal escalation immediately. Instead, I had chosen separation. But separation was still irreversible. Her attorney proposed mediation, faster settlement, discretion clauses. In exchange, she would accept significantly reduced financial terms. Not minimal. Minimal. Not vindictive, but nowhere near the consolidated inheritance she once positioned herself for. The speed of her agreement told me everything. If she believed her actions were harmless, she would have fought. Instead, she moved quickly to contain exposure. Too late. Not legally. Those negotiations would proceed. But relationally, trust, once weaponized, cannot be restored through explanation. The final shift happened when she said something I hadn't expected. "I thought you'd never leave," she admitted quietly. "Not because you loved me too much. Not because you trusted me completely. Because she believed my personality, calm, conflict-averse, composed, meant endurance, that I would tolerate ambiguity indefinitely, that I would rationalize, that I would choose peace over self-protection. She misunderstood one thing. Peace without integrity isn't peace. It's surrender. And I don't surrender autonomy. The mediation date was set. Assets evaluated. Division structured. Confidentiality agreements drafted. It was all happening with quiet efficiency. And in the stillness of our home, the weight of something final settled between us. There was no screaming, no dramatic collapse. Just two people sitting across from each other, fully aware that what was broken could not be negotiated back into existence. It wasn't anger that made it irreversible. It was clarity. And clarity, once gained, doesn't return to ignorance. The formal mediation took place in a neutral office downtown. Soft lighting. Neutral artwork. A long, polished table designed to absorb tension without reflecting it. Our attorney sat beside us, a mediator at the head. No raised voices, no dramatics, just structured dialogue. She looked composed. Elegant, even. If someone walked into that room unaware of context, they would assume this was a standard divorce. Differences grown apart, ambitions misaligned. The mediator began with logistics, asset division, property, confidentiality. Then her attorney attempted something subtle. "My client maintains that all actions taken were done with Mr. Whitmore's knowledge and consent." There it was, the final attempt to stabilize the original narrative. I didn't react emotionally. I opened a slim folder in front of me and slid a single document across the table. The toxicology report. Dated, signed, verified. No commentary, just evidence. Her attorney's expression shifted first, then the mediator's, then hers. She didn't look at me. She looked at the paper. The silence that followed wasn't loud. It was heavy. "This indicates elevated sedative levels inconsistent with prescribed usage," my attorney said evenly. "Repeated over time." Another document followed. Pharmacy refill records. Prescribed under her name, not mine. Still no raised voices. Still no accusation in my tone. Because confrontation without heat is far more destabilizing than anger. Anger can be dismissed as an emotion. Calm evidence cannot. Her attorney adjusted his posture. "We may need a brief recess." We stepped into separate rooms. I stood near the window, hands relaxed at my sides. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt complete, because the truth had been placed on the table without spectacle. When we reconvened, her posture had changed. Less upright, less certain. "We are prepared to revise our settlement expectations," her attorney began carefully. Of course they were, because litigation would mean discovery. Discovery would mean public record. Public record would mean professional consequences far beyond this room. The remainder of the mediation unfolded quickly. She would receive a structured settlement, fair, but not controlling. The house would be sold. Assets are divided under confidentiality. No admission of criminal conduct included in the agreement, but no denial inserted either. Strategic neutrality. At the very end, the mediator asked if either of us wished to say anything directly. She looked at me then, for a long moment. "You never said anything," she murmured quietly. "All this time." "I was listening," I replied. That was all. No speeches, no moral lecture, because the most powerful confrontation isn't explosive. It's undeniable. When we stood to leave, she hesitated slightly, as if expecting something more. An emotional release, a final argument. I offered none. I extended a small, polite nod, and walked out. Closure doesn't require volume. It requires resolution. And that day, the resolution was signed in ink. The divorce was finalized quietly. No headlines, no rumors, no dramatic fallout. From the outside, it looked like two professionals choosing different paths, which in a way was true. Months have passed now. The house was sold. I moved into a high-rise overlooking the water, not as an upgrade, not as a symbol, just as a reset. Fewer rooms, cleaner lines. Nothing that echoes with memory. My routines are simple again. I wake without fog. I drink coffee without suspicion. I manage my health personally. It's remarkable how ordinary clarity feels when it's no longer compromised. People have asked cautiously what happened. "We grew apart," I say. And that's accurate enough, because betrayal isn't always loud enough to explain in detail. Sometimes it's a quiet divergence in values that becomes impossible to reconcile. What changed most wasn't my financial structure. It was my understanding of boundaries. For years, I believed composure was enough. That calmness alone created safety. But calm without boundaries invites interpretation. I now speak earlier, not emotionally, not aggressively, but directly. If something feels misaligned, I address it before it becomes architecture. I also learned something about power. True dominance isn't control over another person. It's control over your own response. I could have escalated publicly. I could have pursued criminal charges. I could have destroyed her reputation. But destruction would not have restored integrity. Separation did. There's no bitterness in me, not because what happened was small, but because clarity replaced confusion, and clarity leaves little room for resentment. I often think about that dining table conversation months ago, when she said she thought I'd never leave. She mistook my restraint for incapacity, my patience for weakness, my silence for ignorance. That misunderstanding was hers, but the correction was mine. Today, my estate structures are more fortified than ever. My legal safeguards are layered. My philanthropic commitments have expanded quietly, not as a reaction, as a realignment. And emotionally, I am slower to trust, but not closed. More observant, but hanyas. There's a difference. I don't regret loving her. I regret ignoring the early misalignments because they seemed small. Small things compound. In finance and in relationships. If there's one identity shift that defines me now, it's this. I am the man who believes confront emotion. I am the man who chooses the timing of it, calmly, decisively, without spectacle. Because quiet dominance isn't about overpowering someone. It's about standing fully aware in your own clarity and refusing to surrender it. If you've listened this far, you might be expecting a dramatic moral, a warning, a declaration about trust or betrayal. But life rarely wraps itself in simple conclusions. What happened to me wasn't explosive. It was incremental. It wasn't driven by rage. It was driven by calculation. And what saved me wasn't strength in the traditional sense. It was awareness. There's something I've come to understand deeply. Betrayal doesn't always arrive as cruelty. Sometimes it arrives disguised as care. Sometimes it speaks softly. Sometimes it organizes your paperwork. Sometimes it hands you a glass of water and says, "I'm just trying to help." The danger isn't in being kind. The danger is in outsourcing your clarity. I don't share this story to create suspicion in your life. I share it because subtle shifts matter. Repeated narratives matter. Small administrative changes matter. And most importantly, how you feel in your own body matters. If something feels off long enough, don't silence that instinct simply to preserve comfort. Silence can be strategic, but denial never is. I chose not to humiliate her, not to escalate beyond what was necessary to protect myself. Some people might call that restraint weakness. I call it control, because in the end, the most powerful move wasn't exposure. It was exit. I walked away with my autonomy intact. My clarity is restored. My integrity was preserved. And that's enough. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever realized too late that someone was slowly rewriting the story of who you were? And if so, what would you do differently now? Let me know in the comments. I read them.